We are back again. We are in Child's History of the World, Chapter 45. Our title today is Muhammad and the Early Years of Islam. We have already heard about two religions that began in parts of the world we now call the Middle East. These are Judaism and Christianity. In this story, I'll tell you about a third religion that began in the same area. The religion is called Islam. Every 100 years is called a century. But a thing that seems a little strange is the 100 years from 500 to 600 is called the 6th century, not the 5th. The 100 years from 600 to 700 is called the 7th century, not the 6th, and so on. So we live in 2023 right now, so we live in 21st century. Well, we have now reached the 7th century, the 600s, and we are learning of a man who was to make a change in the whole world. There lived in Arabia a man named Muhammad. He was born in humble circumstances. Because his parents died when he was young, he was raised by an uncle. His uncle operated camel caravans, which transported passengers and goods, much as trains or trucks today do today. The Arabian city of Mecca, where Muhammad lived, was the center of the caravan trade. These camel caravans traveled across the Arabian desert to North Africa and to the lands along the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. Although Muhammad had little formal education, he traveled to many wonderful places with the caravans and met many different kinds of people. While working for his uncle, he met a wealthy Arabian woman named Khadijah. They were soon married and lived happily together. Muhammad and Khadijah had 4 daughters. The remarkable thing to Muhammad was when he was around A remarkable thing happened to Muhammad when he was around 40 years old. According to Muslim tradition, the story is told he was visiting a mountain in the desert where he often went to study and think. One day the angel Gabriel appeared and delivered a message from God. Muhammad listened to this message and set out to teach it to others. But Muhammad did not intend to start a whole new religion. He believed in the same God that the Jews and Christians worshipped. In Arabia, there were Jews and Christians as well as others who still worshipped idols. These groups often fought over the religious differences. Muhammad hoped that his teaching would make them more understanding of one another. Muhammad saw a lot of unjust and bad behavior around him. He taught that people should change their selfish ways of living and be more concerned for those less fortunate. But of course, it's impossible to get everyone to agree to change. A new religion began instead among those people who believed in Muhammad's teachings. His followers became known as Muslims, and their religion is called Islam. Good Lordy. Islam means submission to God. Khadijah was the first to follow her husband's teachings. Soon others in Mecca followed, but there were some who wanted to stop Muhammad's teaching. In 622 A.D., Muhammad and his followers moved from Mecca to the city of Medina. The first migration is called the Hijra. Some years later, they returned to Mecca, but Muslims today still teach the story of the angel Gabriel appearing before Muhammad and of the Hijra. The Muslims begin their calendar with the year of the Hijra, calling 622 the year 1, just as Christians began their calendar from the year of Jesus' birth, and the Romans from the year of the founding of the city. Have you noticed that Christians, the Romans, and the Muslims each have a different year 1? That doesn't make calendars difficult or anything. Muhammad lived only 10 years after the Hijra, that is, until 622 AD. The new Muslim leaders were called caliphs. The caliph continued to spread Muhammad's teaching. The first caliph was Abu Bakr. The second was named Omar. These teachings were written down and became the Quran, Q-U-R, apostrophe A-N, sometimes spelled as K-O-R-A-N, the Muslim holy book. Quran comes from the word that means to recite, because Muslims learn to recite the Quran when they are younger. Okay. Allah is the Arabic word for God. When Muslims pray to Allah, they are praying to the same God that Christians and Jews worship. Muslims believe that Muhammad was the last of God's prophets. They also believe that Abraham, Moses, and Jesus were all God's prophets. Muslims worship in a building called a mosque, just as Christians worship in a church and Jews worship in a synagogue or temple. They also pray 5 times a day, if possible, wherever they may be. A man called a muezzin goes out on the balcony of a minaret, or tower, of a mosque and calls aloud, "Come to prayer, come to prayer. There is but one God, and He is Allah." We had a chance to hear the Muslim call to prayer when we were in Jerusalem. And, yeah, it was pretty cool, not going to lie. When Muslims pray, they face the city of Mecca because the holiest shrine of Muslims, called the Kaaba, is located there. At least once in their lifetime, Muslims try to make their pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. During the early years of Islam, its leaders were building an empire, much of it in the land that had once been part of the Roman Empire. Muslim armies traveled around the Mediterranean, through the Middle East, all the way to Constantinople. At Constantinople, the gateway from Asia to Europe, they were turned back by Christians who poured hot tar and burning oil from the walls of the city. That does not sound pleasant. The Muslims tried many times to capture Constantinople, but without success. Muslim armies also went westward through North Africa, across the Strait of Gibraltar, into Spain, and across the Pyrenees Mountains into southern France. In 732 AD, just 100 years after the death of Muhammad, they met their match near the town of Tours in France. The king of France had a right-hand man named Charles, who had been nicknamed Charles the Hammer because he could strike such terrific blows. Charles was also called Mayor of the Palace, which meant that he was the chief servant of the king. Charles the Hammer and his French soldiers defeated the Muslims and kept them from moving farther into Europe. In just a century, Islam had spread far and wide. People in countries bordering the Mediterranean, from Constantinople all the way around North Africa on the southern edge, and north through Spain into France, lived under Muslim rule. Many ordinary people had become Muslims. Even today, Islam is the main religion in the Middle East and North Africa. Well, all that looks like we're all finished up with chapter 45. I have one chapter left for this week. Ta-ta for now.